All right, excellent. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Alexander Harlan. I am a research associate with the Orion Policy Institute. We have a great webinar discussion for you guys today. And so we're just going to get right into it. So one of the most prevalent security concerns decision makers, governments, as well as the public are facing today is terrorism. And now with further developments and accessibility to things like artificial intelligence and other information technology platforms and products, we need to dive in and examine how terrorist organizations can take these products and weaponize them against us so that we're better prepared. To go into this discussion further, I'm joined today by Dr. Kat Parsons from the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, Mr. Saul from the Eradicate Hate Summit, and Mr. Jarod Simmons from Base 10 Technologies. So first off, Kat, Neil, Jarod, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. And now I just wanted to turn it over and give you guys the opportunity to introduce yourselves and maybe go a little bit into your lines of work and what you guys do. So we'll start with Dr. Parsons.
Sure. So I am actually a criminologist by training, and I am full-time research faculty here at the National Counterterrorism Center. And a little background on who we are. We are the primary DHS, Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence, tasked with counterterrorism research. And, what makes this perhaps a little more especially relevant is that the T in our acronym is technology. So something that is a little unique about this center is we're very interdisciplinary. I'm working with people in IS&T and who are in the computer sciences and political scientists, et cetera. And so we have a very kind of unique and interdisciplinary approach to the issue of emerging technology and malicious activity. And that's been a research stream that's been prominent here. And so I'm really excited to get to speak about this. Personally, I've been involved more recently in research projects revolving around threat assessment and soft target protection, as well as looking at the sort of changes of domestic violent extremism in the US over time.
Excellent. Neil?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks for all of you for joining. My name is Neil, and I am the program manager for the Prevention Practitioners Network of Eradicate Hate. So the role that I play is really coming at this from a public health approach with a few understandings that, number one, what we are seeing, at least in the US context, is a rise of lone actor offenses and perpetrators. We're seeing increasingly their age trending younger. And in addition to that, these attacks and perpetrations are not inevitable. So through a public health approach, what we do is really work with frontline practitioners, ranging from your mental behavioral health side, working with your law enforcement, your educators, and kind of every other profession that plays a role. And what we do is help build capacity and provide technical assistance for a lot of the frontline practitioners who are intervening in instances of crisis or who otherwise might need support. And so for that, I'll kind of just leave it there, but looking forward to diving more into it.
Excellent. And also, I'm glad that you mentioned, things like the lone actor and, people like that nature, because I do have a couple questions that I want to hit on later in this that will go over that. So awesome. And last but not least, Mr. Simmons.
Hello, my name is Jarod Simmons. I'm one of the founders of Base 10 Technology LLC. We're a small to mid-sized company that focuses on cybersecurity and engineering consulting and services for organizations such as government and large companies. And we mainly provide consulting for cybersecurity on policy and in the engineering and technical side of house. So we work with mainly medium and large sized companies, and we've worked with a few government organizations on their policy and how they are working to handle AI and cybersecurity in the future moving forward.
Excellent. All right. So I guess, the first question that I have for our panelists is, what's the most significant threat emerging from the use of AI or other information technologies in your respective fields?
Sure. So I kind of want to jump in and say that I maybe have a different approach to this. I'm not sure of the other panelists, but I think that the biggest threat we have right now is just sort of a lack of baseline understanding in the general population about what these technologies entail, what they conclude, what constitutes AI, what's the distinctions between generative chat versus other AI models and machine learning models. And just that lack of understanding or comprehension does sort of two things. It allows for, you know, people to just take advantage of that to make over promises of what technology is capable of. There often is a tendency to have this sort of reliance on these forms of technology as neutral, as being perceived as neutral when they're truly not. They're all developed by people and they're all trained by, human content, right? And so I actually view the largest threat in the current landscape is just this lack of public understanding of both what the technology entails and what it is capable of. Because without that baseline, it's very difficult then for us to do things like tackle misinformation, et cetera.
I mean, I think that's a very apt point. I mean, I remember, when we were in, I guess, kind of like the waiting room, I was talking a little bit with Jarod about how perhaps like the new boogeyman in this realm of technology, it used to be, big data, and now it's
Sure.
AI.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with AI, you can't really define very specifics. Like with old data research, you would be able to define specific, like if you're working with a spreadsheet or you're working with a large data set, you can narrow down and specify specific categories, properties to that data. With AI, you train the model, and then if the model doesn't do what you want it to do, then you have to scratch that, figure out where it's getting that perception from, remove it from the data set, and then retrain that entire model, which takes a lot of time. And these companies aren't training their own models. They're using models from other companies. And then when they see that, they go back to the company that provided them the model or the organization that provided them the model. And then they're like, why is it doing this? Which in our experience, we've seen that happen a lot to where companies are seeing biases in the model and then they are restricting model creation based on that. So one of the companies we just worked with, they they were looking for some of the models were providing biased results around gender specifically, and they were trying to figure out how do we get rid of this, but all of this is trained on human data. And you really can't go back and remove those unless you are the company. And then you have to have humans go through that data, find it, remove it, and then retrain it. And it can take months depending on how big your clusters are to retrain that data. So it's really not practical in the long run.
And also just, for my own understanding, like how big can these, I guess, for lack of a better term, like banks of data be that these companies and these people have to go through?
Petabytes of data. So
Wow.
you're usually using old technologies to figure out where it is and take that out, or you're creating new technologies to go through it, like smaller AIs to go through the data and find what you're looking for and remove it for you. But a lot of these companies are using social media and stuff like that, which you can only see how biases could be introduced there. At the end, it's going to behave like a human, and we're trying to create things that don't behave like a human, and there's a big disconnect between how things will actually work and how people want things to work.
It's a pretty interesting take. Neil, actually, I want to get your take also from, I guess, like the public health perspective of like what like the biggest threats that you've seen emerge, especially, with the advent of, it seems almost like everybody's like on social media now.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the trend of perpetrators being younger than before. I mean, we just saw a 14-year-old in Georgia perpetrate a horrific attack last month, if not this month. I think the amount of time that people are spending online is far greater than anything we've seen prior. The ability to share and spread false information, sometimes, and I would argue perhaps even most of the time unknowingly, that clouds doubt in what is real versus what is fake, contributing to an increasing prevalence of conspiracy theories and a lack of trust when it comes to our own institutions. And when it comes to our own institutions, like your local law enforcement agencies, like your local hospital and emergency systems, and like your local clinical providers who are actually providing interventions, risk assessment, and case management, the building of trust is foundational. And so that, I think, is the largest threat that we see, not coming from like AI specifically, though of course it exacerbates the problem, but quite simply just the amount and volume of people being online, a lack of media literacy skills, and the spread of disinformation.
And honestly, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that, trust has been a huge problem in recent memory with just, the rise of conspiracy theories and things like that. I think there needs to be, I guess, kind of like more to what you say, community orientation, and I guess uniting people and just having like a basic foundation of trust. And I guess this also kind of like leads into my next question for everybody, which is, are there any initiatives that your organizations have taken or have advocated for based on what your organizations see as the most prevalent threats because of this?
So I have a bit of a different perspective here, perhaps, in the sense that we are a research center. And so I can say we are funding and working on a range of research projects that are looking at emerging technologies and malicious use. Some things that have come out recently that are, I think, very noteworthy and relevant to this conversation look at the potential for nefarious use of the metaverse, as well as the potential for like, for example, there's some ongoing research looking at generative chat for developing more like, is it going to help us be more creatively bad? Things like that. So a lot of the research that we're doing is trying to get a little ahead of things and try to understand how some of these new technologies can be utilized by bad actors, so that it's not out of left field, so that it's not completely novel, right? So that's where a lot of the research coming out of NCITE right now is orienting.
I mean, would it be safe to say, and I know this is probably going to be a 100,000-foot view of it, but just, I guess, also kind of trying to brainstorm all the very abstract and out there horrible ways that this could potentially be abused?
Yeah, so we're actually pretty big advocates for red teaming here, which is essentially getting, some of the best and the brightest together and sitting down and thinking, like, how can we use this? What can we do? Like, what would be the ways that we could do bad with this, right? And utilizing people who have experience, say, working with generative text, for example, right? Like, and maybe using language and prompts that are able to predict loopholes, et cetera. So a lot of it is just like this idea of red teaming, right? And just trying to figure out what all of these possibilities are, so we at least have like an idea, and it's not just completely surprising when it does come up. Yeah, so
It's going to be so perplexing being evil for good.
I mean, it's a hard thing to sell sometimes, because I've probably a bunch of very obvious reasons I don't need to get into, quite frankly. But when I get out in the field and I talk to people who are in, threat management, who are responsible for protecting spaces, who are thinking actively about, like, how can a terrorist get into this music festival, right? That's what they're doing. And so I think it would behoove people in research and policy to occasionally mindfully adopt those mindsets, because it is one of the ways I think we get more preventive rather than reactive.
Absolutely.
Jarod, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, go ahead.
My answer to this question is kind of in two parts. So
Please.
I think we just launched a bystander and upstander awareness campaign for youth age 12 to 22. It's called Upend Hate. It's upendhate.org. The site is live. We launched that on Monday. We also have an awareness campaign for parents and caregivers called screenhate.org. In my mind, this is not rocket science. And in my mind, the best mechanism for intervention and for prevention is media literacy and awareness of what do you do when you see someone struggling, needing support, or in crisis. The refrain constantly is that you don't want to get your son, daughter, or friend in trouble. And quite frankly, law enforcement is ill-equipped when there hasn't been a crime that's been perpetrated or committed. But in terms of, so that kind of prevention, I think, is where our focuses are, and where I would think more resources need to be allocated in terms of more tangibly answering your question on what have we done or our partners done to kind of thwart the AI or this type of threat. There's we partner with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and on a grant looking at they release online violent extremism monitors for practitioners. So the idea here is that practitioners who are in the clinical space, the landscape online and the language and the memes and all of the landscape online is changing so rapidly. This is designed to specifically provide research for practitioners so that they have a better understanding for their clients in order for treatment. The other things that you can do, again, kind of the flip side of the double-edged sword, is like there are organizations like Project Gravity who we are trying to partner with because that generative chat function, a lot of these people, like parents, caregivers, and young adults, they don't know what questions they should be asking. And you can harness AI to actually deliver them the actual resources that they ought to be looking for, but don't yet quite know how to navigate the World Wide Web to find those resources. So it's a double-edged sword, but those are just a few of the things that we're doing in this space.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned that because, I mean, you know, a lot of this, I mean, I think a lot of people came into this with the idea of, you know, seeing AI as this more so negative and albeit scary thing. But I mean, you point out that, I mean, it can be used for, you know, it has very useful applications. And actually, before we go to Jarod, I was just wondering, could you give like an example of like how these chats can like be used to like help, I guess, formulate questions for people who don't know what exactly to say or to look for?
Sure. All the time, so an organization called Moonshot uses a redirect method online. Without getting into it, it's essentially what are the Google searches or terms that people might be searching. So one is, what do I do if my son is denying the Holocaust? Now that is far from on the pathway to violence. But that is one of the most trending questions in this space from parents.
Wow.
Those people and those parents who are asking, what do I do if my son denies the Holocaust? They are not asking the right questions, perhaps, of what resources they can turn to, who they should be talking to. Is it a faith leader? Is it a school counselor? Do they know the contact information for a school resource officer? Those are the tangible questions that chat AI or any sort of generative AI can help to synthesize in order to direct people to the right place to go.
That's actually shocking that that's one of the most prevalent questions. But I mean, I'm glad that we now have, or at least developing resources for that.
And in fact, I just want to jump in and say there is a chatbot effort coming out of NCITE that's geared towards this. That is a chatbot designed to help talk people through whether or not something should be reported and how to potentially get it to the right source. It's just to say that there are absolutely very, very helpful uses for these technologies. It's not just all bad and all like panic, but it's just putting it in perspective. So yeah, I appreciate pointing that out, Neil.
Yeah, so just to add to that, I don't really have we don't really provide, we more provide consulting services. So we don't have any products or services that we're providing directly when it comes to these things, but things that we see is AI being generated in order to manipulate people, manipulate opinions. As we were talking about earlier, you see it on social media all the time. And these adversaries are more willing to use AI without looking at the consequences, to where people in organizations, big organizations, government, companies, they are more looking at what is the negative repercussions on themselves and their reputation. So they don't adequately respond with their own use of AI because they feel ill-equipped, or they're worried about AI producing biased opinions or false information, whereas the adversaries that you're dealing with don't care. That's just a side effect of their objective to them. And they're not only using it on social media, they're using it in networks. They're creating false information, all these sort of things, all these areas that you wouldn't normally think of, in order to create false information for people that are collecting this to know whether it's true or not. And then we have to filter out, is this information true? Is it not true? Is but it all looks real because they're using AI to generate it. And that's something that, in our experience, these companies aren't willing to do in the US yet, because they're worried about the repercussions. So, from that side, we are actually ill-equipped, when I'm looking at private companies in the US to deal with these things, just because their unwillingness to move forward because they're worried about the repercussions.
Wow. And so actually with you mentioning that, I actually want to jump around like some of like my list of questions because I think you hit on it a bit. Um, I guess in your guys play professional opinions or from your experience, do you think that AI and information technology governance should be the responsibility of some international institution like the UN because it does transcend borders, or is it the responsibility of the tech companies that are developing it, or is there something in between?
Really don't see this as an either or.
Mhm.
I don't think any one body can maintain that responsibility, but I do think that it's a little bit of all of the above. You know, I think absolutely companies have an obligation to think through what, you know, their technology is capable of. With that said, we also need, you know, because these are transnational companies, something that extends beyond just the US, right, and regulations that are based here, which does complicate the issue. And so I think it's just, it's so convoluted and nuanced. We kind of need everyone joining in to help, you know, keep things more ethical, above board, et cetera.
So I suppose like a hybrid system, for lack of a
Yeah, I
better
mean,
term.
I think even then, you know, like the reality of there being some coordinated effort between all these different institutions is probably unlikely. But as you know, if we're able to establish some level of precedent, you know, like the EU, for example, is working on legislation that offers guidelines around AI usage. And those early steps and attempts will kind of help develop this precedent that, you know, then helps inform the models that are adopted by like smaller actors like states, et cetera, which is something we're seeing play out in the US now, and you know, a kind of dearth of a federal regulation here. And so I think, you know, it would be ideal if we could get like everyone involved to communicate and orient. I mean, that's also unrealistic. And so it takes sort of every overseeing body that has a stakes to probably kind of put in their 2 cents.
Yeah, we're already seeing this in social media companies, and it's going to end up being very similar to where, like you see on X recently with their change in management. Some countries just aren't allowing X posts in their countries because they're not complying with those countries' laws. OpenAI already has to do this in certain countries because you can't change what an AI says. Like you can change what you're allowed to ask it. You can change like if it creates a response that's not favorable, you can just have it not say that response or modify the input to provide a different response. But you really can't put guardrails around it like you used to be able when with traditional programming.
Yeah.
Um, and at the end of the day, these countries and organizations are doing this with good intent, but they're going to end up stifling themselves by doing this. So if you look at the EU, they're going to want to put gender guidelines on it. They're going to want to put harmful content guidelines on this stuff. And what's going to happen is you're just not going to be able to offer these products in the EU. Um, Same with the US. If the US keeps going the way they're doing, most of these Western countries just aren't going to be able to embrace AI the way that Eastern countries have been. And again, it's done for the right reasons, but at the same time, they're going to end up just not being able to offer these products. Either that, or you're going to have to train entirely new models, and spend a considerable amount of time and resources trying to make these things quote unquote safe.
Mhm.
Um, it's just going to stifle the rate of progress. So some of this is the company's responsibility. I'm sure countries are going to step in and offer restrictions, but at the end of the day, the companies are going to do what they're going to do, and the countries are either going to set guidelines or they're not going to set guidelines, and that's going to restrict their offerings in those countries or stifle innovation in those countries as a whole.
And just to piggyback off that, I think it's also worth noting that that does open the door then for alternative platforms that simply are the wild, wild west, which is one of the concerns when we look at nefarious actors.
Mhm.
I don't have much to add on this, quite simply because it's out of scope for my professional experience. So thanks,
Yeah.
Jarod and Kat.
The only thing I want to add on to that is there is no win-win situation here. If the West continues with what they're doing and trying to make AI safer, that will be good as far as the companies here not offering malicious information unintentionally, but that does open the door for the East to go create these AIs, which then will perpetuate into the West and
Yeah.
create misinformation on their end.
And
So would you
we've
rather,
seen that. I mean, this is
yeah,
happening in real time. In fact, there
yeah.
are these sort of generative texts that are coming out that are explicitly and intentionally avoiding these sort of safeguards and being offered as an alternative to that technology.
So you're either going to see people, if we continue to restrict it in the West, then the East is going to continue to perpetuate into our media culture and our society and have extended influence into our society, or we can choose to counter it.
Mhm.
But putting the safeguards in, there is no winning here.
That's fair. And also, I just want to mention before we proceed, just for the people that are watching, we are almost at the halfway point, and we're probably going to be saving the last 15 to 10 minutes of this for a Q&A session. So please, if you have any questions, start uploading them.
Oh, yeah.
I guess also going into a bit of like what Jarod said, one of the biggest criticisms that I've seen when doing like some preliminary research about artificial intelligence and the use of it is that it seems that regardless of the developments or what happens, policy or legislation is always going to lag behind the development of the technology. So, I mean, is there anything that you guys see that governments could enact now, or is lagging policy just a reality that we have to build into working with this technology policy?
I feel like lagging policy in the US is just something that's going to continue happening and worldwide. But the good thing about the US is our economic structures allows these companies to continue developing, and then they can just put the guidelines around it later. The problem is whether they will actually allow to offer those products or not, and a lack of understanding in Congress and in the leadership across the US, not even Congress, in company leadership as well. It's kind of hard to explain to somebody that hasn't grown up with this stuff to explain to them how this stuff works and why they can't just change the output on what the AI says. So the lack of understanding is lagging even further behind traditional technologies.
I really agree with that. I think there's also something I'm seeing in the kind of practitioner space is a lot of new products coming in for say security systems that are really over promising what their potential is. There's just a reality when we're looking at securing like an event space. And I think this has been really thrust into the national forefront recently, right? Is that there has to be that human element, right? Like you can't replace people in a security setting with these AI technologies. They rather need to be seen as tools to help those people do their jobs better. And the problem comes when we, are kind of like offered, well, this solution takes care of this. And, a lot of companies want to minimize workforce, right? Especially the ones that aren't directly bringing in more cash flow. And that's going to be oftentimes security and paying for extra security. So it can be very appealing, the idea of having some cameras in a parking lot and having this kind of automated system that's live reviewing your security cameras. But that's only so helpful if you have the infrastructure then to deal with something as it arises. And so, that information piece, that awareness piece goes, I think, also kind of both ways, in that we need to know what AI can't do and what these technologies are not capable of. And that is oftentimes that they don't replace the role of people so much as they can be of great assistance to these existing processes. And with that said, I do think I agree in the sense that we're always going to lag. We don't need to lag this much, though. Like, we don't need to be this far behind the technology. We can probably, one of the ways I think we can mitigate that is, first, again, just this kind of baseline education would be very helpful. I don't know. I'm not going to claim I know who that should come from. I'm not saying we need to change our K through 12, curriculum developments or anything, but I do think there's clearly a need. There is a need for a greater baseline understanding, both in the policy space and just sort of more generally in the population. But also red teaming, again, is another important element here, in my view.
I mean, personally, I would be more than happy to have Neil as my AI literacy teacher if I was in elementary school. But
I don't think you do. My perspective is I'm kind of gonna answer this question by not answering this question, largely because in my personal role, and within kind of the network, we're focused less on tech policy and AI policy. Granted, Eradicate Hate does a lot of work with some of the major tech companies like Microsoft and Google and TikTok and YouTube. The work is quite different, though, in terms of what we would like to see on federal tech policy. One relevant discussion that we are having is what does online to offline referrals looks like, which is a space underexplored, and can be quite messy when it comes to jurisdiction, state and international laws and lines and territories. I would actually argue, from the practitioner standpoint, the policy and legislation is actually better focused on the states than it is on the federal side. But that might be something we can go into later.
So again, I'm actually glad that you mentioned this. I guess it's like a jumping off point to more the state side of things. So I know that recently California has just initiated legislation where perhaps like a vendor of technology or artificial intelligence, if it's used improperly by a customer for nefarious purposes, they could be held liable. And then also, I know I actually just recently spoke with a colleague of mine who works in the Maryland state government, who said that they're actually going to try this coming legislative session to update Maryland's revenge porn laws to include AI-generated photos and videos and things like that. So I was wondering, I guess this is more so for Neil, but I mean, I could be for all the panelists, like, do state laws and I guess like that, like jurisdictional divide, does it help or hinder your work?
Both, I guess. So, I mean, in terms of state legislation, and or both in terms of government mandates and statutory law, nearly almost half of the states have anonymous tip reporting lines. And from the literature on those anonymous tip reporting lines, being able to submit a report anonymously and have the confidence that it will be taken seriously is one thing that the other states should learn from, who haven't already implemented that. There's ways that where you even, and just because you have a mandate doesn't actually mean that you have the resources to effectively pursue and enact that mandate. But there's other things like extreme risk protection orders, what are otherwise known as red flag laws, um, capacity building mechanisms, better guidance on like permissive and mandatory statutes for clinicians' duty to warn and duty to protect, especially now that you have things like SIPAC, which lets clinicians work across in multiple states and be licensed in multiple states. Additionally, mandates to have threat assessment, what they call behavioral threat assessment and management teams, and school counselors just in public education settings. Like, it is shocking to know that in some schools you have one school counselor for hundreds of students in their student body. It's just infeasible, and their bandwidth, nobody has that bandwidth. So I would just kind of think of this more holistically when we talk about policy, to include not just what I would call the tech aspect of this, but actually more comprehensively when it comes to a public health informed approach. What we say in this field is hurt people, and those people need help. All of the policy ideas that I just mentioned have been initiated in different states. Different states have different models and methods of training. We are not yet in a position as a field to look at the efficacy of a lot of those models, thanks to NCITE and some other researchers that do this work. They are building that body of literature. But in my mind, kind of point being is, I think that state action in all of the ways I just mentioned actually might go further than some of the other federal policy that I think is more sexy to academics and policymakers.
That's fair. Well, and I guess one follow-up for you, Neil. Do you have any concerns about, I suppose, going back to, red flag laws or anonymous tips, the issue of, I guess, like plausible deniability, where perhaps there are instances where someone perhaps has a disagreement or a dislike of someone and then calls it an anonymous tip on them, almost kind of like, like a swatting incident?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is that is extremely rare. In the states that have implemented anonymous tip hotlines and reporting mechanisms, the overwhelming majority of people take them seriously, and there are very few false flags.
Okay. I mean, is there like, do you know if there's, I guess in like the states that have it like, where you say it's like rare, there are just like consequences for false reporting and things like that, I assume?
Yeah, it's something I'm less familiar with. So I'm not exactly sure about each state's kind of consequences in that realm. So
Fair enough.
I will say, just from a legislative perspective, and especially looking at like the issue of law enforcement, it's very difficult to mandate, for example, systemic changes in law enforcement at the state and local level from a federal level. These things are inherently, separate in our system. And so it can very often be far more efficacious to have that kind of policy adopted at the state level. And in fact, what we've seen, and I'm just currently rolling off the law enforcement example here, but what we've seen is when we've seen, for example, certain threat assessment or community policing practices adopted by major police departments that are some of the more significant forces, like LAPD, NYPD, these really massive metropolitan areas that have handled things like terrorism quite a bit. Then we often see similar, maybe locally adjusted policies adopted following that, sort of like institutional isomorphism. They set sort of a precedent in policing oftentimes when it comes to these standards. So, there's sort of a pragmatic side too, where, where can we actually accomplish the goals? And if the goal is, for example, as Neil's talking, sort of building up these, resources around like law. And I think you mentioned earlier, law enforcement, it's a challenge to begin with because they're not inclined to deal with people in the sense of avoiding an arrest. It's often arrest oriented, right? It's a very different framing. So the very long story short version here is that pragmatically, it can be much more challenging and a lot less catered potentially to individual needs when it's coming from that level. And there's a lot of room for it to be contested legally. Whereas policies that are kind of more locally driven, a little easier to enact a lot of the time, and do tend to have some form of influence.
That's very fair. Thank you. So also, Neil, if you don't mind, I promise I'm not trying to pick on you. I kind of want to circle back to, I guess, more so the perspective, like the at-risk individuals and things like that, that, clinicians might have to deal with. So, and I mean, this is honestly, I mean, it's profound what I read recently. It's also kind of sad that there's an article talking about how one of the current pandemics that we're dealing with is one of loneliness. And that a lot of people are supplementing like social interactions with online chat rooms and things like that. And frankly, one of my biggest concerns, and I hope to God I'm not giving some malicious actor any ideas here, but I could see perhaps a terrorist or a terrorist organization or actor developing some sort of AI or algorithm that could identify essentially millions of people that meet the criteria of susceptible, and then streamline the recruitment process with like chatbot like generated responses and instructions, and essentially have a whole army of homegrown extremists with just like a keystroke of just like one malicious actor. And so I guess, is there certain things that you've seen in your experience, Neil, of how someone could gauge if perhaps a close friend or family member has been recruited and things like that?
Yeah, and sorry, my computer's telling me that my internet's unstable.
No worries.
So I think professionals in this space would reframe and ask questions. How do close family members or friends, what we call in this field intimate bystanders, help when they are concerned about a loved one? So there are organizations like one in particular called Parents for Peace. And that is when you have anyone, a loved one, who you are concerned about, you can call in and get clinically provided support. So those individuals are calling, quite literally saying, like, my dad has radicalized. He, and has access to weapons. What should I do? I think really what we focus on here is there is no profile. So you can't profile or law enforcement your way out of this problem. And it's really going to come down to risk and protective factors. So again, this is kind of shifting the focus on, okay, who is about to commit an attack? That is very clearly important. And we obviously have the intelligence community and the apparatus to address those types of questions. The practitioners I work with are really looking at, we know that 80% of school shooters display some sort of leakage. In other words, they have expressed this desire verbally, online, in text message with friends or family and close loved ones. We know that nearly half of perpetrated targeted attacks are at places of workplace, and usually the overwhelming majority of those happens when someone has recently been laid off, and they feel that their grievance and their violence is justified to atone for that grievance. So I think the questions are really for people who have had. We should really be looking at this from a trauma-informed care rather than asking questions like, what is wrong with you? We should be asking what has happened to you, and really figuring out how do we actually intervene and put people on a supportive pathway. So that can be occupational training. That can be if someone is, we work really closely with Senior Threat Manager Matt Talbot, who's now with Kroger and who is plays an outsized role in the Association for Threat Assessment Professionals. He was discussing an anonymized case where this individual really just needed to be paid forward for a couple of weeks because they had an unstable life conditions and were looking at being evicted, et cetera. So these are, again, this is not this is not rocket science, and it's really about how do we actually provide support, and a lot of times it's clinical support for people who are flirting with violent ideologies, dealing with things like either psychosis or any other kind of serious mental health issue, so on and so forth. I hope that answers your
Absolutely.
question.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you'll all indulge me with a moment to get up on my soapbox, obviously, the importance of mental health and things like that. One of my New Year's resolutions that I've been sticking to is just, you know, sending out a text to someone, reach out to them, just say, hey, just checking in, hope you're doing well. And I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but maybe sometimes even just that could be like that avenue of getting someone to open up and like talk.
Mhm. No, absolutely. Well, I mean, we look in this space of behavioral threat assessment and management, BTAM, that Neil and I are both familiar with, and it is very much a framing, oftentimes around risk factors can tell us a lot, but they're not going to actually tell us if someone's going to commit violence. But we can emphasize protective factors or the things that we know pull people away from violence and work on building those up. So there's often this idea of this almost linear progression of like you go down the rabbit hole and then you're just going to kind of more and more extreme until you're pushed to violence. That's just often not the reality though, right? Like oftentimes people have a culmination of things, maybe there's strong beliefs, maybe there's a personal grievance, maybe there's a series of things going on in their life that are coinciding with this. And then there's often some kind of triggering event, maybe losing the job, losing a spouse, something of that nature. And so, there may be ways of using AI, and I think we're seeing some of this already, honestly, when it comes to the generative chat, of using these tools as a means of potentially recruitment, or at least, sounding like the sort of alternative information sphere we see in some of those extremist circles. But at the end of the day, what actually drives an individual to violence and not just maybe being a computer screen warrior often has to do with this interaction of effects in the real life. And so, I'm also really an advocate for the public health approach there too, and kind of leaning into that BTAM model, because we're never going to know who would or would not commit an attack. It's just not data we can have. But we do know that we can, emphasize protective factors that are known to reduce the likelihood, and leaning into that model is probably going to be the most helpful, even though it is often somewhat counterintuitive to say like, oh, this person is threatening to like come and kill their coworker, and you're telling me not to fire them. But that mind shift, I think, is actually can be the most helpful.
Absolutely.
But
And so,
does that track with you, Neil? Did that? Okay.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say when we're working with companies to develop insider threat programs, we deal with this a lot.
Oh,
And
sure.
those companies, you can track people's Skype chats, you can look at all that sort of stuff. That stuff, it does not have a very immediate correlation to whether somebody's actually going to commit offense or not.
Right.
Usually you have to look at disciplinary actions on them or disgruntledness within the organization,
Right.
especially with younger generations, because things that older generations wouldn't joke about, younger generations do. And that doesn't necessarily translate to them actually committing acts of violence
Yeah.
at all. Like they will say phrases that directly imply violence, and they could be like the least likely person to actually do it.
Right.
Um, so it really doesn't help all that much.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. Actually, so I was in a webinar last week talking about insider threats specifically. And that actually was our kind of big recommendation there, is that you can have all of the computer programs you want that are monitoring for, language or access, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's, happy employees don't kill their coworkers, right? Like they don't attack their organizations. So emphasizing those elements again, like that's what can actually institute change.
Yeah. The biggest,
Furthermore, go ahead,
sorry.
Jared. Sorry.
I was just going to say the biggest thing we see is if an employee is disgruntled, they're going to reach out. And if they don't get a response, then they're more likely to do something. If they do get a response, they don't. And unfortunately, the larger the organization, the more ill-equipped they are to handle the response, even though they have big departments and stuff to handle this. They just don't have that one-on-one interaction, or they ignore it, or it's just seen as not that big of a deal.
It's an
unfortunately.
over-reliance, I think oftentimes on those technological systems. And just to add, I know I'm dominating here, but just to add also, a lot of the times when we rely on that, technological framework, these computer systems to automatically detect for nefarious language or unauthorized access, that can oftentimes be far more reactive than preventive. So in the sense that if you have a company culture that allows for that one-on-one, then you're very much less likely to have the kind of nefarious activity that often suggests potential insider threat than if you don't, right? So again, it is not rocket science, right?
Yeah.
There's a difference between target hardening and prevention. There's less evidence that target hardening suffices for prevention. And I don't have the statistics, but I think the majority of perpetrators are targeting the location in familiar settings. So it's people going to their own workplaces, it's students going to their own schools, so on and so forth. And you're not going to be able to prevent, you're not going to be able to harden those targets from those individuals who already have access.
Yeah.
So, all right, guys, just so I see right now we only have one question in the Q&A. So before we get to that, because time is about to wrap up soon, I've got one final question, and boy, is it a doozy. So let's just get right into it. So, I mean, to me, it seems like the 2024 US presidential election appears to be like a near perfect storm. We have rancorous partisanship where both sides believe the other is trying to destroy the country. There is an air of distrust amongst both government institutions and the news, a sea of disinformation, and, the results could very well be decided in the courtroom as opposed to actually on election night. So might be a loaded question, but I mean, is there a best way or any possible way to, I guess, combat this inevitable tsunami of misinformation, tweets, posts, essentially, regardless of the result, trying to discredit the election? Oh boy.
Who wants to jump in first, y'all?
I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at it. So listen, I think one thing we can do is refocus a little bit. We know that there's altered information and generated content. We know that there's deep fakes. We know that these things exist. But like look at the AI and hand example. It used to be like you could tell if something was AI because the hands were wonky, but then they got better, at creating hands. So I'd say it's probably honestly better to just focus around verifying original sources for what they are and having, like the equivalent of like a watermark on what is an actual non-altered source, versus trying to wade through all of the content out there and I try to identify what is and is not generated or altered in some way. And I'm just going to throw out red teaming again. Because I just think that this is a really helpful approach to a lot of us when we're having these discussions, especially when we're looking at things that have big unknowns.
Yeah, I mean,
it's super hard to anticipate what the problems are that we need to prepare for and try to prevent, without that kind of understanding. Like if we're the good guys, we're maybe not great at thinking of like the bad guys. We could be missing things, right? So I'm just going to throw that out there again. I know that's all very like
oh no, absolutely,
very general, very high level. But they're not easy answers to this question. Means.
Yeah, I'd like to say that politics in the US, and try not to wade too much into politics here, but this election cycle has been very much about disqualifying and invalidating the other opponent's opinion, which we haven't really seen that much in previous elections, other than the 2016 elections, but before that, opponents were very fair to each other. They would acknowledge each other's truths, and they would work together and treat each other fairly. This election, neither side is really offering any sort of fairness to the other side in any way, and they're not really backing down. So that that's leading to the distrust, right? Because if one side can say something and lie about the other side, and they both do that to each other, then who are you going to trust? And then when we have partisan news networks in the US as well, when we have Fox for Republicans, CNN for liberals, so and such, so on and so forth, these fact-checking panels aren't really effective. Because if you're looking at it on CNN, you might assume that they're biasing towards the Democrats. And if you look at it on Fox, you might assume that they're biasing towards the Republicans. So really, you need sort of like a community notes, like on X sort of perspective, to where you have people of both sides going in, and then you're generating an opinion that is neutral because you have both Republicans and Democrats uh, culminating to create a shared opinion and shared facts about the details, and then they're um, voted on by both parties, so that you don't really end up with fact checking that is biased towards one side or the other. Um, because unfortunately, this election cycle, people aren't really trusting the fact checkers because there's been evidence of people, organizations posting false information, whether intentionally or not.
I would only add that some shout outs to a few of our partners who are doing work on this particular issue, like Rachel Kleinfeld with Carnegie, who's leading the Targeted Violence Research Network. They're doing a lot of the research into this, into political violence. One thing to think about is trusted messengers. And what particularly comes to mind is We the Veterans. And they did a campaign in the election of 2020, and I believe are replicating it for this election, called Bet the Vote. It's essentially working with veterans to become poll workers, because veterans' voices are generally trusted and they are considered trustworthy messengers. And so when we are looking at accusations of ballot stuffing and so on and so forth, having a veteran, a non-political veteran or apolitical, whatever you'd like to call, having them say that they were the ones who were working those polls adds a little bit more gravitas. That's one sliver against this insurmountable challenge, but just one thought.
In my defense, I
Cool
did say it was
idea.
going to be a doozy. But all right, yeah. So just we have one of the questions from the Q&A panel. Says the CEO of Telegram was arrested last month by French authorities for alleged offenses of failing to mitigate the misuse of Telegram for criminal and extremist activities. Do you think similar legal accountability should be imposed on such tech companies and their executives in the US or other places? I mean, also, I guess kind of adding to that, we saw a similar situation where the Brazilian Supreme Court just won a legal battle with X to send a legal representative down to take down accounts. So, I mean, it's not like there isn't precedent for this now.
Mhm. I think this depends on regionality as well. If something like this were happening in the US, then we would have other issues to worry about. In the US, we have privacy laws, um, like similar to the ones that Neil mentioned, that these privacy laws allow us to communicate freely without intervention by the government, without intervention from other organizations. And violating those laws in the US would be constitutionally a constitutional violation. In the EU, UK, France, like these countries don't have similar laws, so I can't really say what what they feel is appropriate is what they feel is appropriate. Um, I'm just going to go ahead and leave my personal opinion on it because I feel like this is extremely personal and kind of a political opinion here. I don't think you should blame anybody for using a tool. Um, the tool, if you produce a tool and somebody else misuses it, then I don't think there should be any legal repercussion to go back on use of that tool. But that's just a personal opinion.
Yeah, totally fair.
Yeah, and my addition would be, again, coming from my crim background, as Jarod notes, we do have a very different level of civil rights and protections here, that is at times in quite contrast with other parts of the Western world, and that would make this a very different process, and a very challenging one in the US. So it's hard to do like an apples to apples comparison there. With that said, you know, maybe the real question is thinking about what the equivalency here would be. I'm not sure. I'm just saying, like, you know, it's difficult for me to like think of it as apples to apples in that sense.
In terms of litigation and accountability, this is not the question you asked, but replicating what we saw in Michigan and in Georgia with holding parents of perpetrators accountable is something that we're keeping our eyes on. You know, the perpetrator, the 14-year-old perpetrator in Georgia, his father was indicted. It remains to be seen if other
Right.
parents heed those lessons, but an interesting ad for litigation here.
That is an interesting precedent. It is something for all those interested worth watching and following up on for sure.
Might need to do a follow-up webinar about it. All right, well, so, you know, I think this is a good stopping off point. I want to thank everybody that's tuned in. And also I want to give a big shout out to our panelists who took time out of their Friday to be here and to make this an exceptional webinar. We got, you know, Neil Saul, Dr. Parsons, Mr. Jarod Simmons. I guess one final shout out. Do you guys have any publications or like websites that our viewers should take a look at?
Yes, go to our digital commons on the NCITE website where we have all of our lovely reports published,
Excellent, excellent.
including many relevant to this particular topic.
EradicateHateSummit.org. That's where you can find more info on PPN, including my email, and then again, upendhate.org and screenhate.org for children and caregivers, respectively.
Excellent.
Yeah, we provide services and consulting work, so most of our stuff is private, but if you go to base10tech.com or base10 technology on LinkedIn, you can reach out to us for consulting services or otherwise.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you guys so much. Have a great Friday.
Thanks, you as